So this is our final session for today's conference, and it addresses what Ms. Trevisani, if she's still here, had raised earlier in terms of policy and tech initiatives that can help address the long wait times that have been discussed so much today. But before we begin the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce the moderator. His name is Marc Frey. Marc is the senior director at Steptoe & Johnson. But before that, he was Chief of Staff in the Office of Policy Development at DHS. He has a lot of experience dealing with the various DHS agencies, to include TSA, CBP, and the rest of the alphabet soup that we know and love at DHS. He also served as in the department as director of the Visa Waiver Program and a senior advisor to the department's chief security officer. So without further ado, I will turn the stage over to Marc and the esteemed panel. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Stephanie. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to CSIS and to U.S. Travel for facilitating what should be an interesting discussion. I will go out on a limb in the beginning and promise fireworks from this panel. There'll be pens being thrown, drinks being tossed in people's faces, because this is the panel right before lunch, and so we need a little lively engagement. Before we get started, I will give very brief introductions of the panelists, both because their bios are in your handouts and because we do have such a distinguished panel that to actually go into detail would take up probably most of the time that we have, and I think that's better spent on the substantive discussion. So first we have CBP Acting Assistant Commissioner Kevin McAleenan, Office of Field Operations, and before he took that job, had a distinguished career in a number of other senior positions in CBP, so it's hard to think of a better representative from a CBP and DHS perspective on this panel, so thank you. Next to Kevin, we have Sharon Pinkerton, who's the Senior Vice President for Legislative and Regulatory Policy at Airlines for America, or A4A. She's been with A4A and before that ATA, before they recently rebranded for a number of years, and before that had senior positions in the executive branch with the FAA and in Congress. And last but certainly not least is Chris Browne, who's Vice President and Airport Manager at Dulles, and before that he held a similar position at National. So again, from sort of the three stakeholders in this debate, the CBP, the carriers, and the airports, it's hard to imagine a more qualified and more distinguished panel, so thank you all for coming. And I think we'll probably go just in the order in which we're seated. We'll start out with Kevin, then go to Sharon and Chris. And just before we start, in terms of framing, we already heard quite a bit during the first panel and the Congressman's keynote about having to balance security and facilitation. And I think everyone would agree that's the trick. You have to have the security function. You have to make sure that the bad guys aren't coming here. But at the same time, from an economic standpoint, from a competitive standpoint, you need to facilitate travel for legitimate folks who you want to come here, go to business meetings, visit our tourist attractions, and otherwise spend money in the United States. And of course, as Michael said, travel on our planes, rent our cars, et cetera. So the balance is tricky, but I think one of the things we can delve into today is how both policy and technology can work so that those two things aren't mutually exclusive or in tension, and in fact they're mutually supportive. I think we've heard a lot already about global entry, and I think that's a prime example of how you can implement policies that both enhance security and improve facilitation at the same time. I think there are others, some of which are connected to the Visa Waiver Program, such as the implementation of ESTA, the Electronic System for Travel Authorization. And so I think what will be interesting to hear from our panelists is, again, not the points of tension between facilitation and security, but the things going forward, particularly from a technology perspective, but also from a policy perspective, as to how those two things can support each other. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin. Thanks.
Good morning. Understand from the keynote speaker in the first panel that we might be facing some challenges here. If I could acknowledge my role in that, I'm the head of field operations, which means I oversee the ports of entry in the United States, our pre-clearance operations abroad. So I'm responsible for the CBP aspect of this. And I do appreciate CSIS and U.S. Travel for organizing the event and bringing together really some leading thinkers and some close colleagues, folks that we're working closely with to try to address some of these areas. So given the, I think, articulate setting forth of the challenges we're facing, I won't dwell on it. I'll just put some maybe operational context on it from our perspective, and then we'll move toward the solutions aspect of what we're doing. So a few amplifying points. On the traffic increases, you've heard a lot of numbers, but I'd like to take it down from the national level, which is pretty tremendous, over 12% growth in 3 years, tracking again for 4+% international air travelers. We're already at record levels, and we're going to exceed 100 million in FY13. But how that looks at some of our key ports, the top three, for instance, JFK, Miami, and LAX. JFK and LAX grew in the 14% range in 3 years. Miami is over 20%. Where Mr. Wascom was talking about Americans' operations. We have our key airports in Texas, Houston and Dallas, are up in the 21–22% range for growth in 3 years. And then there are the mid-size emerging destinations for international travel like Las Vegas, which has grown 67% in a 3-year period. So these challenges are against a backdrop of flat or declining government resources. And you can imagine that the vectors are moving in different directions, so we have to find solutions to close that gap. Obviously, we expect the pattern to continue. You heard from the Department of Commerce and the travel authorities, and certainly with the changes in Brazil and the northern tier of South America, the growing economies in Asia, the Middle East, the travel boom, we are expecting the similar travel increases, and that's consistent with what we're hearing. So we are seeing increased wait times as a result, both in terms of our averages and our peaks at really all the international gateways, and some are being affected more than others. I think that's important to acknowledge that. There are a couple of other operational aspects to this that I don't think were covered by the first panel that I'll just provide for your context as we talk about solutions, because they're important in terms of the challenges they present to us and the inefficiencies they present in terms of our ability to staff effectively. And that's the tendency at our international gateway airports to have both peaks, very sharp peaks of traffic, usually 1 or more times a day, as well as outlier flights. I'm actually grateful to the first panel and Michael Wascom for laying out this morning at Miami, for instance. You heard the 72 booths available, 8 to 14 staff available in those first hours of the morning. I think also you heard him note that the first flights were coming in at 4:30 a.m. The last flights come in after midnight. In fact, we have another terminal at Miami that's open 24 hours a day. It's an international airport. So we have the challenge of the peaks, and then we have the challenge of the outliers at the same time. So it places a lot of pressure on us to staff efficiently when we need to have a mass staff for certain peaks during the day, and we also need to have adequate number of people to clear a flight in a reasonable amount of time very early and very late. We understand there are very good reasons for this. There are commercial realities to when flights want to leave and arrive from the major regions of the world. We see at some of our middle America transit airports that have flights coming from Europe, from Africa, from Asia, from South America. They could have 3 or 4 peaks in a day because they all want to come in at the same time and then meet domestic connection banks. And that's a significant challenge for us. That's a commercial reality of international air travel. We also understand, especially on the Europe side, there's tight competition and negotiation over slots and times that they can leave the foreign airports. So that's a key aspect of this. But just to provide a comparison point on the efficiency in terms of our staffing, at San Ysidro, a land border port of entry in Southern California, the biggest and busiest port in the world from any country, we process about 25,000 pedestrians a day. That's roughly on average the number of passengers or travelers we process through LAX. So we have 14 primary booths in San Ysidro that process these passengers. Granted, the wait times are not what we would like in that pedestrian environment, but that's compared to over 100 booths and about 80 of which we staff at peak periods at LAX in 5 separate terminals. And that's due to the challenges of peaking and outliers. So it's in the staffing complexity is obviously much greater at LAX. So the air passenger environment does provide some of our toughest facilitation challenges and pushes us. We also have the infrastructure issues, which I think were acknowledged. A lot of the U.S. airports are aging. They are not big enough. They're not designed for efficient passenger flow. Frankly, they were designed for a time in the international area when we had 3 different agencies managing the international arrivals process. Now we're one agency, and we're actively working with airport authorities and carriers as new terminals are built, as renovations occur, to make that as efficient as possible for our revised, coordinated border process. So that's some of the operational context I just wanted to add in terms of the challenge. I think we also heard very well this morning about the importance of international air travel to the U.S. economy. And I can't tell you how strongly we support, agree, and understand that. I think we were asked to remain committed to facilitating this travel, and I can tell you it's a core aspect of our mission. It is very high on my personal agenda. It's very well understood and focused on by our front office. And if any of you have been watching the news lately, you've heard Secretary Napolitano. Obviously, the President has articulated a strategy on this. This is an administration priority top to bottom, and it's a priority for me and for our port directors and frontline officers around the country. We truly understand the value to the American economy, and we realize we cannot be a choke point to economic growth, even as we work to secure the border. So we're very committed to it, and it's a core aspect of our mission. Staying on the mission for one moment before we get to the exciting technology aspects and the future and what we're looking forward to doing, I must emphasize that this is not a ticket-taking exercise. This is not a part-time activity. This is not a hobby. This is a broad, complex, and challenging law enforcement mission that's addressing multiple types of threats crossing our border. Terrorism is our priority mission, always first and foremost. Inadmissible persons seeking to enter the country illegally through the legal points of entry. Counter-drug mission, very important, even in the air environment. The focus seems to be on the land border, but it comes through both passengers and cargo in the air environment. Agriculture. One of the most critical threats that we address at the border is the threats to U.S. agriculture, one of our most important industries, one of our most important export industries, hearing the emphasis on exports. The pests and diseases that can come both through passengers and air cargo are a key focus for us as well. And then, of course, we have our trade protection responsibilities, import safety, intellectual property rights. These are issues that are also present in the air environment. And while we know from our randomized baseline surveys that the vast majority of travel is legitimate, 98.6% the last several years has been legitimate, safe travel. That means that at JFK on a given Saturday in the summer, while the vast majority of those 40,000 passengers are legitimate travelers with no issues in those multiple missions, there are 500 people that we need to address. We need to find those 500 people that might have a customs issue, that might have an agricultural violation, that might be inadmissible through that vast process of 40,000 people arriving in 500 passenger chunks in an A380, or in 3,000 passengers in a 20-minute stretch during a peak at Terminal 4. So this is the context in which we're operating. I think it's important to understand that. So given the challenges, given the mission imperatives and the very important mission imperatives for the American public, what is our strategy to not become that choke point, to change how we do business, as my Department of Commerce colleague noted, so that we can keep pace with this growing travel? It's essentially 2 fairly clear pillars. We need to do everything we can in collaboration with our partners in the travel industry, the airport authorities and the carriers, to maximize our existing resources, first and foremost. And we have a lot of good work going on in this area that I'll talk about. And the second is really reinventing ourselves, transforming our processes with innovation, with technology, with new thinking from top to bottom, everything we do in the air passenger environment. We have a major throughput problem. It's fairly simple if you understand it in that sense, and there are 2 major approaches to that. We can have more people in more booths, or we can improve our processes to speed them up, or some combination. And so what I'll talk about is different strategies we're taking to approach the increased throughput that we need. The first is the risk segmentation strategy. I'm going to have to borrow my Department of Commerce colleagues' talking points because she nailed it. I mean, that's what we are implementing. That's what we're doing every day. It starts with our efforts to use advanced information on passengers and cargo to identify those high-risk people and things that we want to spend more time on, that we want to secondary and focus on to make sure they don't present a threat to the United States. The second major element of that is to increase the percentage of travelers that are trusted, that are known. You heard lots of kind words for the Global Entry Program, some recommendations on how we can improve it. That's a huge focus for us. We want to get as many travelers as possible into the Global Entry Program. That allows us to process them essentially without a wait time at primary. It allows us to understand the low-risk passengers that we process, and we want that percentage of travelers to get as high as possible. And it's growing exponentially. We have 10 times growth the last 2 fiscal years in global entry, and we have record applications every week this fiscal year. Part of that is a partnership with TSA and PreCheck, which we're going to continue to expand. But we're very excited about the growth. You're seeing some of our major gateways get to 8, 9, 10% of eligible travelers using global entry on a Friday or Saturday now. We want that number to continue to increase. That'll help the overall throughput, and it'll also increase security. You've heard the term, I'm going to pause on that one for a second, because you've heard the term balance several times in terms of balancing security and facilitation. You know, that's a framework that we've kind of moved beyond in our own thinking and our own approach, because we think those techniques that help us segment risk both increase security and increase facilitation. We don't have to balance them. We can be smart about how we approach the traffic coming at us, and through applying these techniques in a consistent way, do both at the same time. So not necessarily a balance, but an improvement that supports both aspects. And I'll give you another couple examples. Global entry is a key one. The second major aspect of maximizing our current resources is really the whole efforts to manage the flow of passengers. You know, certain airports, certain terminals, we've developed this into a science, but there are a lot of places where we believe we still have room for improvement working with the carriers and the airport authorities. 2 of the programs that we've offered and that are really meeting with significant success in many of our international gateway airports are called Express Connect and One Stop. Express Connect is where we work with the carriers to identify those passengers that have short connection times, to pull them out and put them in special lines so they can make their connecting flights. We believe that's a critical thing for the industry in terms of the economic disruptions, critical to the passenger experience, and we want to support that. That's working very well, pioneered in Chicago O'Hare. We also have One Stop, and the idea with One Stop is more and more people are traveling without checked bags. That process that was referred to at the exit checkpoint, that can take some additional time because we're seeing the people for the first time with their bags. Do the luggage, does it make sense with the passenger? Does it make sense for their purpose and intent for visiting? If they have 10 significant bags and they're saying they're coming for a 4-day vacation, we're worried about a customs violation perhaps. That's an important aspect of our mission. But so many people are traveling with just carry-ons and they're getting stuck behind the second process. We'd like to move them into this one stop where they go to primary, and if infrastructure can enable that, and we're working with several terminals to do so, they can go right out to their next flight. They can go right out to carry on with their day and their visit to the United States. A second aspect of flow management, kind of overlooked, it's blocking and tackling, if you will, but it's really the queue management. It's clear and signage so people know how to move through a terminal, where to go next, and it's service representatives that can help explain what documents they need, how the process works, and where they should go. The airports that we've been able to work with to do that effectively, it makes a huge difference, and we'd like to continue to build on that. Then there's the gate management. We are the afterthought in the gate management process. The airport authorities and the carriers need to bring planes up to the gates, whatever's available, essentially. What we've asked and what we're working on in several places is a more strategic approach to that. So we have big terminals. There's sometimes a lot of walking between the aircraft and the primary. If the first flight of the day comes to the nearest gate, and those 300 passengers come out, and then the second flight goes to the furthest gate, and they have a 20-minute walk, then our flow is metered, and we can balance it out. If the first flight goes to the furthest gate and the second flight goes to the nearest gate, then we have 800 passengers arriving at the same time in the FIS, and that challenges our process, and it challenges the carriers in the wait time. So we'd like to work on the gate management. We think there's some room for improvement there. I think you heard about the transparency on the wait times and the ability to share our information real time and what we're experiencing. We're working with A4A and the carriers on doing just that. We want to have a shared understanding of what we're facing that day and understanding how we're going to staff it and how we can work together to move those passengers effectively. And we've automated all of our tools that do this, so we can really precisely tune our scheduling to address the flow the best that we possibly can. So that's the existing resources piece. And there's more going on, but that's a summary, and I want to get to questions, and my colleagues have a chance. So transformation. One more minute.
One more minute.
All right.
And then I'm going to ring the little bell.
But they're going to want to hear this part. This is the good news. All right. Transformation. We are moving toward a paperless, seamless, passenger-directed process that is much more efficient and secure and dramatically improves the traveler experience. I'll just name the two key aspects of this. First is automation. Historically, there's been a lot of paper documentation involved in a border crossing. Now, for the immigration forms, we have the I-94W that came from the Visa Waiver Program countries. We've eliminated that. We have an electronic system that does the I-94W. We're eliminating the I-94. We're going to get rid of the customs deck and the gen deck. We want to be paperless. I've set a goal by 2015 for us to have a paperless passenger arrival process for both the passengers and the carriers. One. Second is transforming primary. You heard a lot about primary. You heard some skepticism whether we can apply technology to do this from Jeff. But really what we want to take is what's now a largely administrative process and move that away from primary. So our law enforcement officers can do law enforcement work focused on that passenger. That means using kiosks. So we're simultaneously processing groups of passengers. The air carriers have proven this in the check-in process. Using mobile, to the question from the woman from CSC, on-board solutions, pre-departure solutions. We believe all of these can have a role in taking care of the administrative biometric capturing, confirmation of the passport, the customs declaration. All that can be done before they arrive at primary and make that a quick, effective process. Our friends at CBSA in Canada have proven this. They've demonstrated it with their kiosks. We've learned a lot from them. We've borrowed from their business case. We're working with them to pilot this in Vancouver, and we're going to move to domestic airports this year. And I will stop because I just got the cough. But thank you for your time, and look forward to taking your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, in particular for that very articulate overview of the immense complexity and challenge that CBP faces on a daily basis, trying to find those proverbial needles in a haystack. So now I will turn it over to Sharon for her perspective.
Thanks, Mark. And that was a very thorough overview by Kevin, so thank you very much for that. I guess I want to start by commending, actually, Kevin, so no fireworks yet. Because frankly, you know, we've worked very closely with Customs over the past many, many years. And I can say, as been somebody who's been engaged in working with TSA and FAA for over a decade, I think Customs stands head and shoulders above some of the other agencies in accomplishing some of the goals that they're trying to accomplish, whether that is automation or segmenting the risk, stakeholder outreach, et cetera. I think that they are a good example. That being said, I mean, I think the reason we're here today, we have issues in this area. And for that reason, airports, airlines, U.S. travel, Consumer Travel Alliance, IATA, Global Business Travel, we've all joined together to try to see how we can, as a group, work with CBP to try to address some of these issues. I mean, one of the main things that I think is interesting for us all to notice is that Kevin's not saying that there's not a problem. In fact, he's saying there is a problem. He's saying there are persistent and excessive wait times. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And so the coalition of folks that I mentioned earlier have gotten together and have talked about what we think some of the short, medium, and long-term solutions might be, both policy and technology solutions. We've shared those with CBP, so there aren't any surprises in the things I'll talk about today. But you know, one of the things that we've talked about, which is, I understand it's somewhat controversial, is I do think we need to have a common goal in mind. In other words, what's the right amount of time for somebody to stand in line? For those of you that are followers of the aviation industry, you know that DOT came out with a rule about 1.5 years ago that said customers shouldn't be on board planes any longer than 3 hours. That's a good rule of thumb. Not saying that we have 3-hour waits a lot at CBP, but it does happen, those outliers that Kevin talked about. But more importantly, we're not even meeting what we think is a common industry goal of trying to ensure that folks are processed, 80% of the folks are processed within 30 minutes, and really nobody should take more than 60 minutes to be processed. And as I said, I think my point on all of this is that Kevin's not necessarily disagreeing. We're not meeting that kind of a goal, and so the question in front of us is, how then should we proceed? We've identified some things that we think are important. One of the things, again, that Kevin mentioned was this idea of data. We'd like to have a data-driven discussion with both CBP and Congress. CBP has a lot of very, very rich data, and I think Chris is going to talk more about this. And recently, I will say, we have made more progress in getting CBP to share with us where and at which ports those excessive and persistent wait times. The reason that's incredibly important for us to have that kind of transparency on the data is if carriers and airports are going to do their part in trying to address the situation, we really have to understand the data in terms of where the problems are on a persistent basis. The next thing that I want to talk about, which is also controversial, is, and something I'm not sure I heard much discussion on before, is this whole idea of resources. Because while the things that Kevin talked about, automation, risk-based segmenting, getting rid of I-95 forms, we're all for it. But what's really going to move the needle? I think the discussion really needs to be more about resources. And I think something that's not very well known is that aviation pays more user fees into CBP than any other mode. You know, the functions are joined together, customs, ICE, and APHIS. And if you look at what aviation contributes versus other modes, we contribute 81% of the user fees versus 15% by other modes. In other words, there are plenty of folks, and let's just, you know, I'm not necessarily interested in naming and shaming, but the land border gets a lot of resources, but doesn't pay any resources in. Aviation, on the other hand, pays in a lot of resources, whether that's through our vessel fee or our passenger fee, and yet we get about 40% of CBP's resources. So this is one of those issues that gets put in the medium and longer term category because it is controversial. It will require both Congress and CBP having a willingness to do a cost-based user fee study to see who's using the resources and who's paying and who's not. But I think, again, to get at those issues that are really going to move the needle, we're going to have to do that. In the meantime, we would urge CBP to recognize the discrepancy that exists now and to do everything they can to try to proportion their allocation of staff in a way that's fairer than it is now. We are working very closely with U.S. Travel Association to try to understand and put a dollar figure on the whole economic impact because, as I said, we support what CBP does. We recognize that for every CBP officer, they're enabling you know, X million dollars worth of travel and tourism to come into this country. So we're trying to not only quantify what the benefits are of having those staff at airports, but also the cost to us. You heard Mike talk about the situation in Miami. It's prevalent across the country. We've got misconnections. We've got hotels that aren't being booked, tours that aren't being taken. So we've got to have a data-driven discussion about that. Other issues that I wanted to talk about that, again, I know aren't always popular, but we are going to be talking to the Hill about part-time employment. One of the reasons it's so expensive is because we've got full-time law enforcement on. And we understand you can't have a part-time law enforcement, but we'd like to get into a position in which we're unloading some of the administrative duties that CBP does and giving those over to part-time employees. Global entry. We're very supportive. I'll echo the comments I heard Jeff make earlier, and that is we'd just like to see it expanded. You have to travel to get your interview. You have to wait for your interview. It's limited. We'd like to see it expanded even to frequent flyers that are non-U.S. citizens. Again, all of that I realize will take time, but we're willing to do our part to make all that happen. Kiosks in primary, you know, again, Kevin talked about One Stop and Express Connect. We're very supportive. We want to move forward with those things. I think that we're working well together. But the fact of the matter is times are tight. We've got sequestration breathing down our necks. We've got some innovative ideas that have been thrown out in the discussions on sequestration that we don't think are helpful. We are going to be advancing our position, which is that we believe the Secretary does have discretion through the CR to move money around, and we think that this is an area that delivers a lot of economic bang for the buck, and we'd like to see the Secretary demonstrate the President's commitment to international travel and international tourism when he said he wants to increase that to 100 million, our international travel. We're going to have to put the resources behind that if we want to have the infrastructure ready. CBP is a good partner, so we're ready to do our part.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks for giving that overview of the carrier's perspective, and in particular for delivering on my promise at the beginning by injecting some controversy and some unpopular. So now I'll turn it over to Chris, and the bar has been set, and you've got to add to the controversy so we can have a lively discussion afterwards.
I'm aware that I'm the 6th and last panelist of the morning, and I stand between you and lunch. So I suppose I need to be brief to make sure we have questions. But you know, a lot of what I have to say has been captured in the remarks by others, but let me try to package some of it from the perspective of airports. Obviously, my experience is one at Dulles and National, but I think more broadly, many of the points that I speak to are an industry perspective that airports share. And, you know, I like to share with an audience, if you'll allow me a moment, to sort of state, I guess, the obvious, but it's always important to me to understand the industry that we're in, because it's really unlike any others that I'm aware of. You have airports which are different governance models, whether they're state-owned or authorities or county-run or county-owned. We're public agencies, but we don't get appropriations, certainly not the larger ones. We are self-sustaining, revenue-generating entities. I cannot run a deficit, so I have to behave and run like a business, despite the fact that I am very much a public agency. The airlines, obviously, and think of a three-legged stool, the second leg of this stool, have the private capital, private enterprise. And oh, by the way, their capital is extremely mobile. So if my airport isn't competitive, they take their asset and literally fly it elsewhere. The third part that makes up the success of this industry or the failure, the third stool, if you will, are the government agencies that, and this is a key distinction, that don't just regulate our industry, they operate. They have a very operational role in the conduct of aviation in this country, whether it's the FAA, the TSA, or the CBP. And whether you're thinking of healthcare or energy or any other industry, I don't know of another one out there where the government, by design, and arguably appropriately so, plays a key operational role. So when we talk about sequestration, we see the whole model failing when our federal partners who play operational roles are not resourced to what they need to do. It's very different than, you know, the National Park Service or DOE or some other agencies in terms of how that industry conducts its operations, I would argue. When CBP does not get the resources they need, the whole model fails. And I think that that's what we're seeing. You know, Model Ports was an effort several years ago to begin to define this process with regard to international travel, because we all play a role in it. I mean, this is a shared issue. I am so invested in their success, I can't succeed if CBP is failing. And I think we all share that. We are joined at the hip. The stool fails if any one of us comes up short. And what Model Ports tried to do is say, okay, let's look at it broadly. What needs to be done to make this work? And certainly from the perspective of airports, it was, you got to have the facility in place to meet the demand. And our industry doesn't always have that. It's getting increasingly difficult for airports to come up with non-debt financing and other means of financing for these very large capital projects. But nevertheless, we completed a $180 million expansion of the international arrival facility at Dulles to the point that it now has twice the capacity of what we currently see. We have over 20, we have 2 facilities that have a combined 74 kiosks, or 74 stations, if you will. So we did a lot of things from the facility perspective, and airports get it, and that's the role we play. We've got to build the facility. And then what are the customer touch points? Things like signage, queue management. What are the other things that we can do, flow management? Well, for our part, what we said is, okay, we will hire, we refer to them as student ambassadors, college students who are and in many cases, multilingual, that working with our team at Dulles, the CBP team, we embed them into the queue, and they manage the queue. And that has effectively relieved CBP of a function that they formerly assumed. So that we manage the queue. These students have radios with the CBP command, and they're speaking in multiple languages. So we're very cognizant of that touch point. Airports are doing that. We're investing where we can in the personnel to help this flow in this process. Signage and the like, we get it, we understand it, but then at the end of the day, Model Ports said you've got to have the staffing. And this is where there's a limit to what airports can do. And I will say, getting ahead of myself, this is where I part with some of my own colleagues. Maybe this is where the fireworks are, Marc. Because I have colleagues in the industry who are saying, surely out of frustration, the heck with it, we'll pay for the agents. We'll pay for the agents if it means that we can shorten the lines. And I take great exception to that. It is the wrong way to proceed, and it cuts to a key point. Because if I start paying for agents directly and work with my port director and say, I think you need 20 more agents, I'll go buy them, I have no insight, I have no clarity, no transparency to the process by which the CBP staffs, quite frankly. I can go to the FSD, the head of TSA at Dulles, or the air traffic control manager, and I can say, Jim, Eddie, what is your authorized end strength today, right now? And how did you get that number? And how is it supported or not? I can tell you what those numbers are. I have those conversations. But the CBP has historically not been able to do that. And it's not because they're bad people. It's not, we have great people at the port level, trust me. But the reality is I have no insight to their staffing model. This was a subject back in the 2005 GAO report. And in my mind, no disrespect to my partners, again, I'm vested in their success, but we've never seen or been able to get insight to what the staffing model is. So when I say that we're adding Emirates, Etihad, Qatar to the Dulles landscape, and I go in and say we're bringing these people in, there's no dialogue as to, okay, what is CBP's response? There's no formulaic model, and if there is, as an airport operator, we don't have access to it. So how did this manifest itself? Every year at most of our international airports, there's a seasonal shift in air traffic. The summer schedule wanes, winter schedule, so we go from, Air France will go from 3 dailies to Paris to 2 dailies, and they shift their flights, and sometimes it's 20, 30 minutes. When those requests came in this fall, the CBP denied the landing rights of a British flight and an Air France flight to Heathrow and Paris. That's a watershed event, okay? I mean, if that isn't a statement of failure, then I don't know what is. Now, we're a landing rights airport, which if you look at the statute, gives the CBP the authority to say, landing rights denied because of inadequate staffing. It was, in my mind, the first public acknowledgement where the CBP said, we agree, we don't have the staff to do this. You airlines, you can come, but you got to come at a different time. That's a very different paradigm than what we've dealt with, which is we're a full-service airport, come one, come all, come whenever. The challenge was that the data that they used, in my estimation, and again, these are good people trying to make good decisions. I have yet to meet a CBP agent that enjoys processing somebody that stood in line for 2 hours. They don't like it any more than we do, or the passenger. But the data that was used, that was presented to us, that drove that decision of denied landing rights, I believe was flawed data. It started with the fact that the CBP used OAG data based on available seats. Well, I know with consolidation and everything, we got full airplanes, but we don't have 100% full airplanes. And if you look at, they use notional staffing availability at a given hour at Dulles, when in fact the port director has, with great success, been able to work with agility over time, moving people around so that when those peaks hit, the numbers were actually different than what was presented. And so when we began, and we've got this all laid out, and we've worked with our port director on it, what was shown to us is, Dulles, you have 4 big peaks. We're denying landing clearance to these 2 aircraft because we need to get them out of the peak and get them into an off-peak. Even 20 minutes will make a difference. Well, the reality is, as you look at the numbers based on actual staffing, in which we did, and the way when a flight hits a hall, it cascades into the adjacent hour very often. I mean, the dynamics of it is such that it wasn't so easy of just moving it into the off-peak, because the reality was 20 minutes to the left or right was not an off-peak at all. So the takeaway for me on this was, I looked at it and I said, you know, if we had sat down in advance, collaboratively, and said, what is the data? And if we had all looked at the data together, I dare say that we could have avoided the denial of landing rights to those 2 aircraft. Now, it wouldn't have fixed the problem. The problem, we all agree, I think, is inadequate resource for what we're trying to do. And so for an airport to bring, to assist in the problem, you know, if I'm going to reach out to our congressional folks and say what is needed, I need to know what is needed. I can't tell you whether Dulles needs 10 people, 20, or 30. And you know what? I don't know that our port director can either, because we have not had the kind of conversation looking at the data collaboratively. You know, the interesting thing is the CBP has outstanding data. They now have the ability to know from block time to when that passport is scanned. They can tell you with the line weight of every single traveler. But you know how the data is reported on the website? Maximum average wait time by flight. Well, I'm not going to get into a statistical overview of it, but when you start looking at it that way, you're missing a whole lot. It does not paint the clear picture. I think Kevin has alluded to the fact that with transformation and so forth, there's an intent to move beyond that. And if that's the case, I very much welcome it. I think, you know, I'll sort of wrap up now because I know there need to be time for questions. But, you know, I think, and it may sound offensive, I think airports are by and large doing their part to try to help this process. I disagree with airports that are saying, let's throw more money and hire more people. If I can control those people, and I know where those people are coming and going, and how they fit into the broader question, then we can have that discussion. But until we get the kind of transparency and access and clarity to the data, the people that help pay my bills, the airlines, would crucify me if I go out and hire a bunch of people and then I can't turn to them and tell them whether they're here or whether they've migrated off to some other place. So, you know, I think that the takeaway, in closing, the real challenge is to continue to work collaboratively, to recognize that we are so vested in each other's success that at the end of the day, we got to tell the story. It's got to be told accurately. And to do that, we've got to understand the data. We've got to look at the data together. And then the message to political leadership and others will be one message. And it'll be a message that ultimately says, we've got to resource to this need, or else we will have failure as described. And it'll touch every sector of our country and its economy. So on that note, let me pause and see what kind of questions may come out of it. Thank you, Marc.
Well, thanks, Chris, again for delivering on the promise, and in particular for, I think, by giving some real-world examples, showing what I think everyone on the panel and everyone in the room would agree with. You know, the three-legged stool analogy is a good one. This only works if everyone is working together, and if one leg is off balance or out of kilter, the whole thing can topple. I was going to lead off with a couple of questions, but I think maybe the best thing to do here is to maybe let Kevin respond a little bit to some of the issues raised. And again, because I think that, you know, in part his response in a certain sense will be, well, I don't want to speak for him, but you can't get blood from a stone. There's only so much resources go around in this time of declining or flat or declining budgets, even post-sequestration. But you all raised some, I think, very interesting points, and I'm sure that Kevin has some equally interesting responses. So rather than ask a question, I'll actually just turn it over.
I might surprise you by starting with agreeing with Chris on several key points that he made. Don't worry, we'll get to some fireworks. So first of all, the investment that IAD made in the model ports effort, you know, both with the facility, the signage, and the personnel, has helped Dulles be one of the actually really the only top 10 airport that's held at current wait time levels for the past several years. So I think an investment in that has made a big difference in our ability to provide good service there. The second, I do think we need to continue to improve our communication. That's why I started with the maximizing our existing resources. It's got to be collaborative with the airports and with the carriers. And really, I think part of what we're seeing is we do have good data on both sides, but we see it and we understand it differently. And one of the things I think we need to get to, I think Jeff referenced this morning, is a shared understanding of what we mean by wait times, what the airports and carriers mean in terms of calculating the entire process, and we need to do better at that. In terms of the watershed of a landing rights moment, this authority to manage landing rights and to provide optimal services has existed for decades. It's been applied at many airports many times. I did it as a port director, and it's not that unusual. I will also note that the end of the story is that those flights were not denied, that those times were denied, and they are coming in today to Dulles, slightly off the peak before and after it. And I would only disagree with Chris in the sense of how much of a difference that makes. That metering makes a big difference. The closer they are stacked, any one early or late, it gets higher and higher and a steeper peak, and it frustrates our ability to provide decent service levels. So I agree on the work they've done. I agree on the collaboration communication. We got to improve on it and make the landing rights process more transparent, bring it up front, align it with FAA, make sure that they have that full conversation before we even get to a point of being concerned about a specific time or a specific flight. We owe them that, and I'm glad to hear your commitment to engage in that. But we're doing that so we can provide good service. So it's an airport-wide conversation. So all the stakeholders, the other carriers that would have been impacted by those flights stacking up are involved in the conversation, and it's intended to provide the best service possible for all.
Great. Yes, Sharon or Chris, any response?
Well, I just wanted to chime in on one thing that Chris brought up, which is a shared concern that we have. I vaguely referenced it in my remarks, but that's this idea of having the private sector reimburse customs. So in the CR, there's a new authority that was given to CBP to enter into these reimbursable agreements and let the private sector reimburse them. And it's a huge mistake. We have argued strongly with the administration and the Hill. This issue was brought up in the context of the United Arab Emirates, which wanted a pre-clearance facility in Abu Dhabi where no U.S. carrier serves. And we strongly oppose any position that would enable the administration to essentially start a pay-to-play type of scheme where foreign governments can essentially pay for our national security staffing, especially when no U.S. carrier serves that area, that particular airport, so their passengers aren't going to be facilitated. What Congress has done is a more limited type of project, but it creates the same bad incentives that Chris already talked about, and that is you essentially have a lack of transparency and understanding who from the private sector is paying for what. And guess what? As I mentioned earlier, the private sector, we're already paying. We're already paying, in terms of aviation, more than our fair share, while others are paying little to nothing. So the resource issue is a tough one, but we think we need to start addressing it on a very rational basis now before we start heading down this road of a pay-to-play scheme where, you know, every interest possible has the opportunity to engage with CBP for reimbursement of services.
Chris, anything to add before?
No, Kevin's absolutely right. The flights are coming into Dulles. They ultimately did adjust their schedules. You know, 20 minutes may not seem like a lot, but when you've got a departure slot out of Heathrow, some of these internationals have very strict limitations and connects and so on and so forth. So, you know, this did get a lot of attention from some key players, and when I say watershed event, it was a watershed event for Dulles, because to my recollection, we had never had landing rights denied of an international carrier. And I guess my only confirming point is that you know, the airlines, for their part, they need to make the schedules available 6 months in advance, which they do, because in fairness to the CBP, you know, if they're going to change, they've got collective bargaining agreements, if they're going to change work schedules to meet an airline schedule, they need 30 days notice. And so to the extent that we're talking early and often with each other, I think that we can really accomplish a great deal. And I guess, you know, the takeaway again for us is, you know, let's have those conversations, and let's make sure we're looking at the data together to make sure that whatever conclusions are made, that we all agree to it. And ultimately, I think the conclusions, the broader one will be that we are not getting, as an industry, the resources we feel are needed, and then that begs the question, all right, politically and so forth, how do we go about securing those resources? So, Kevin, you're right. I guess that's the Paul Harvey part of the story that I didn't want to deny.
Thanks, Chris. At this point, we have time, I think, for a few questions. Same rule apply. Please make them questions, not statements, and to the extent they're directed at Kevin, a reminder that he's armed, and so just you know,
not wearing my vest.
That's right. That's right. So be kind. All right, we'll start with Patricia, and then we'll go over to Stuart.
Earlier today we had Patricia with the U.S. Travel Association. Earlier today we had Congressman Joe Garcia here doing the keynote, and he spoke a lot about immigration policy and the focus on immigration in Congress. Do you believe that that is a viable vehicle to potentially, where there is a need for Congress to take action with additional resources or authority for some of these changes, for hiring of part-time individuals? Is that a viable vehicle for this? And is this something that you see as a bipartisan sort of item that could be included in the immigration debate. That seems to divide a lot of people. But is this something that potentially could bring people together?
Anyone want to go first?
A couple, so I think the quick answer is definitely, because there aren't a lot of things that Congress is going to be able to agree on, but it seems that immigration reform, even though I think it's really difficult, has been one of the issues that's been identified where they really want to pass legislation. One of the things that I think we can all agree on in terms of resources that I'd like to see the immigration reform bill used for, some of you don't know, but with the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, some money got taken away from Customs. I think it was $80 million a year when the exemptions for people traveling from the Caribbean, Mexico, and Canada got taken away. So those folks now are paying the customs fee, but that money is not going to Customs. That's the kind of thing that I think we should all be able to agree on and fix. There's also some excess ESTA fees, the electronic travel authorization for the visa waiver countries has brought in more money than is being used. Also not going to Customs. We need to get that money back to Customs. So I think the short answer is yes, that should be a vehicle that we can all work together on our list of short, medium, and long-term solutions where we can try to get some quick wins on these answers.
Monument Policy Group, sorry about that. I was going to ask about the Colombia FTA, but thanks for bringing that up already. On global entry, I guess for Kevin primarily, but what can the private sector do or the rest of the U.S. government do to try to encourage more of the bilateral agreements that would allow foreign travelers into the program beyond what y'all have already negotiated, where mostly it's an American program now, which is great for us, but not so great for guests coming in from overseas. I know y'all have tried to move forward, but it's still pretty limited amount of countries that are involved. And what can be done to try to ramp that up for low-risk foreign travelers?
It's a good question, Stuart. I appreciate it. We are focusing on international expansion as a huge aspect of our growth strategy for global entry. We do have, you said it's not that big with other countries. I would say there's a big exception, which is Canada, where almost 8% of the air travel from Canada is either through Nexus or global entry, and it's a huge benefit for both countries. And we're obviously growing quickly with Mexico on global entry. But we have agreements in place with a number of key partners, the UK, Germany, Korea, and we'd like to continue that growth. And one of the things the private sector, I think, can do to help, we've seen American Express, we've seen United Airlines and some other carriers paying for their premium members. That's increased our applications dramatically. We have this graph where we chart the applications, and every time there's an announcement like that, we get a spike of applications immediately thereafter. The other thing we've seen is with the advocacy of carriers that have influence in their home country, Lufthansa with Germany, British Airways in the UK, they're able to help spread the word about the value of the program. And we think that's very, very helpful, and we're continuing to partner with carriers to see if we can target some of the other real big travel origination points for the U.S. so we can add to that reach of global entry.
Thanks. I think we probably have time for one more question, so right over here.
My name is Marty Math. I'm unaffiliated with anybody. As an interested traveler, and this is a technology area, I was wondering what you are doing in respect to trying to use data-driven screening, and in particular, how are you thinking about protecting personal information? Particularly, we had a hacking incident that was in the papers this morning.
I think it's a great question. We are doing extensive data-driven screening to help secure both the aviation as it makes its way to the U.S. and, of course, the border of the United States, partnering with the airlines to get information on their passengers, reservation and manifest data. and using very sophisticated analytics to assess that with the latest intelligence to determine where we might see risk. In terms of protecting that data, that's a key focus. We follow all the strictures of the Privacy Act. We work closely with our Office of Privacy at DHS, the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, that both audit and ensure that we're carefully protecting that data. I'm going to knock wood because we have not had a breach of that nature on the cybersecurity side, and we have a great IT department that works to address any potential threats.
Great. Well, with that, please join me in thanking the panel for an interesting and lively discussion, as promised. And again, thanks to CSIS and to U.S. Travel for facilitating.
Thank you all for coming and for sticking it out through the keynote and both panels. I'd like to extend a special thank you to U.S. Travel Association for their support in this endeavor, and to our panelists and our moderators. Thank you all.